Eh. Today we are talking about Koosh and Batoni, right? The two medicine men who attempt to help Taiyo. And Koosh is called by a grandmother when Taiyo was returned from the war and suffering from PTSD. And he can't really get out of bed and he can't keep any food down because he feels physically nauseous. And so grandmother calls old Koosh. And Koosh is a very traditional person. On page 34, feel free to jot this down. Even if you wrote down descriptions of Koosh, page 34 to 38 would be useful, and jot down a couple quotes, I would say. During my little speeches here, I'm only going to be talking about important stuff. And so, just as when you are in a college class, I think a good rule of thumb would be to take notes and jot stuff down as we go, but it's up to you. It said, Koosh, he spoke softly, using old dialect full of sentences that were involuted with explanations of their own origins, as if nothing the old man had said were his own, but it all had been said before, and he was only there to repeat it. Taiyo had to strain to catch the meaning, dense with place names he'd never heard. His language was childish, interspersed with English words, and he could feel the shame tightening in his throat. Now, the problem here is that, number one, Taiyo's background, he gets made fun of because his mother was Native American and his father was not. And so people feel like he has not been properly taught tradition and traditional beliefs. And so when this guy comes to talk to him, he's using words which Taiyo does not understand. And the fact that these words are the same way that they've always been delivered means that this ceremonial process that this guy is going through is the same as it's always been. The problem is what Taiyo has experienced in the war does not match up with what these ceremonies are capable of helping with. And Koosh is going to talk about that here. On page 35, he goes on and said, maybe you don't know some of these things, vaguely acknowledging the distant circumstance of an absent white father. He called Josiah by his Indian name and said, if he had known then, maybe he could have told you before you went to the white people's big war. He hesitated and looked into Taiyo's eyes, but you know, grandson, this world is fragile. Now, Taiyo, in terms of all this guilt and all these problems and things he's thinking about, feels a great deal of guilt and feels as if he played a great role in breaking this fragile world, right? The drought's here, Josiah's dead, Rocky's dead, everything's kind of falling apart, and nothing's working out. The word he chose to express fragile was filled with the intricacies of a continuing process and with the strength inherent in spider webs woven across paths through sand hills where the early in the morning of the sun becomes entangled in each filament of web. Leslie Soko, who's the author of this book, there's a lot of kind of grim description in the beginning. Taiyo's life was tough, right? Especially when we get kind of his childhood and stuff like that. As the book moves forward, pastoral writing is a term used to describe writing that describes nature beautifully, and she does a lot of that. I'll show you a couple pictures of the place that we're at in New Mexico. And if you've ever spent any time in the desert Southwest, you know kind of what we're talking about here. Anyway, there was a responsibility that went with being human, said old Koosh. The story behind each had to be told so there could be no mistake in the meaning of what had been said, and this demanded great patience and love. More than an hour went by before Koosh asked him, you were with the others, the ones who went to the White People's War? Then he said, now, when Taiyo and Harley and Leroy and all these guys, Emo, come back from the war, they're all struggling, right? Because they all experience very difficult things. The people on the reservation who did not go to war did not understand what they're going through, right? And these returning veterans cope with their difficulties in various ways, right? A lot of them drink, right? They get together, drink, and then they tell war stories. Taiyo does drink some, but he is struggling, right? So Koosh, who's older, looks at this generation of young Native American dudes and says, you understand, don't you? It's important to all of us, not only for your sake, but for this fragile world. Then Taiyo goes on and said, I'm sick, but I've never killed an enemy. I've never even touched them. He was shivering and sweating when he sat up. Maybe you could help me anyway. Do something for me, the way you did for the others who came back, because what if I didn't know I killed one? Now, here's the thing, and this is where the ceremony as it's being performed on Taiyo is not equipped to deal with this situation. Koosh said, the old man shook his head slowly and made a low humming sound in his throat. In the old way of warfare, you couldn't kill another human being in battle without knowing it, without seeing the result, because even a wounded deer that got up and ran again, left great clots of lung blood or spilled guts on the ground. That way the hunter knew it would die. Now, when people in old ways of warfare, which was more hand-to-hand and swords and various things, you would see people you killed, right? There would be visceral evidence of it. There would be blood and all kinds of stuff. In this war, people could have been shooting at each other and it jungle warfare, and you might not necessarily know that you killed somebody, right? And that's even exacerbated more now by drones. Like you could be sitting at Air Force Base in North Dakota and killing someone on the other side of the planet that you never even see, right, in person. Then he says, going on to page 38, we got a couple good quotes here. There are some things we can't cure like we used to, Koosh said, not since the white people came. The others who had the scalp ceremony, some of them are not even better either. He pulled the blue cap over his ears. I'm afraid of what will happen to all of us if you and the others don't get well. All of us means the Native American people, right? If this generation of young people, of young men, struggles with PTSD and is unable to pull out of it, that doesn't bode well for the society as a whole, right? Because it's a kind of a missing generation. So Taiyo also feels guilt for that. Yesterday we went through or a couple days ago, we went through all the different ways on that circle that all these thoughts are connected, and this is another one, right? He feels responsibility. The old man had made him certain of something he'd feared all along, something in the old stories. It only took one person to tear away the delicate strands of the thread, spilling the rays of the sun into the sand, and the fragile world would be injured. Now, going on a little bit, now, so that's Koosh, right? And the reason Koosh does not work for him, one, these ceremonies have not changed, right? One of Batoni's big points that he's going to make to Taiyo, and this is my favorite quote in the book, he said, things that don't grow and change are dead things. If the stories don't change, if the ceremonies don't change, if people don't change, then they're not really living, right? So then on page 116, now if you were writing the Remembering the Stories essay, this section would work well. Batoni, he talks a lot about that kind of thing. So go to, let's see, hang on. Okay, sorry. Go to page 117. Now we get some descriptions of Batoni. And it said, people ask me why I live here, he said in good English. I tell them I want to keep track of the people. Why over there, they ask me. Because this is where Gallup keeps Indians until ceremonial time. Then they show us off to the tourists. He goes on and he said, so even though where Batoni lives, it looks down over this area down under the bridge where there's lots of homeless people and people who are suffering from alcoholism. And it said, people wondering why I live so close to this filthy town. But see, this Hogan, where he lives, was here first. Built long before the white people ever came. It is that town down there which is out of place, not this old medicine man. Batoni didn't talk the way Taiyo expected a medicine man to talk. He didn't act like a medicine man at all. Now on page 119, we get some little details that Batoni is going to be someone Taiyo can work with, right? There are several characters in the book who talk about what their eye color is, right? We see this with Night Swan, and we'll talk about that. We see it with Batoni, and we see it with Tesei, the woman that he meets in the wilderness later, right? Now, Taiyo had long been given a hard time for his mixed background, right? And his eye color was one way to determine that he was not, both his parents were not Native American. Now, it said Taiyo and Batoni's eyes are the same way. Then Taiyo looked at his eyes. They were hazel like his own. The medicine man nodded. My mother was a remarkable Mexican with green eyes. Now, Batoni has mixed background as well, right? And people like Emo had given Taiyo a hard time about his ancestry his whole life, right? And to finally meet someone who is proud of it and views it as a strength is an important thing for Taiyo, right? Now, go to page 121. In his house, in his Hogan, Batoni has a large collection of things that he's gathered over his travels. He's got calendars, he's got phone books, he's got newspapers from all over the world. Page 121, it said, in the old days it was simple. A medicine man could get by with all these things, but nowadays, he let his voice trail off and nodded at Taiyo to complete the thought for him. All these things have stories alive in them, okay? Now, at the bottom of 121, Native American boarding schools are kind of an ugly part of American history. And this was the American government's way of trying to remove the Native Americanness from Native Americans, right? And so kids were taken or sent to these boarding schools, and immediately they were given different haircuts, right? And given different clothes and given different names and forbidden to speak their native language, right? Now, after a year or two, when they returned from school, they look different, their hair is different, their clothing is different, and they're dressed in technically the style of the enemy, right? They speak a different language, and if you lose your language, you lose your culture, right? And you can't talk to the people at home, and you lose the stories, right? Because the stories don't get translated. Now, Batoni's mom did something a little bit different. She sent me to school. Sherman Institute, Riverside, California. That's the first train I ever rode. On page 122, it said, I was a big kid then, bigger than the rest, but she said, it is carried on in all languages now, so you have to know English too. Now, rather than learning English as a way of diminishing Laguna language, right, and replacing traditional native beliefs, his mom viewed that as a source of power, right, and as a way to carry on these traditions even though things are changing. Okay. Now on 120, we'll come back to the rest of the ceremony with Batoni coming up in the next day or two. But he's very different, right? He's much more contemporary, and his quote, "Things that don't grow and change are dead things," right? And so even in these, Taiyo's worried about completing these ceremonies the way they've always been done because as Batoni, or I'm sorry, as Koosh said, the world's fragile. One person could wreck everything. But Batoni's going to show him that that's not the way it is, right? And if you believe it, then it's real and it's good. So we'll continue on with our weird trimester. So make sure you're doing the reading at home. Keep going with Heart of Darkness. If you have any questions on Heart of Darkness, feel free to let me know and email me. Ask any questions you have. Yeah. So hang in there. I'll talk to you soon.